I'm John Henry Westen. Thanks for joining me on Truth and Lies, the show where we shed light on common misconceptions and come to a fuller understanding of the truth. In my work in media, I have found that it is essential to speak the truth with love, because love for all people, because we are all children of God. And with that in mind, let's have a look at this week's topic. Should assisted suicide be permitted for the suffering? Let's take a moment to consider that. Do you agree? Do you disagree, and why? Is that your own opinion? The opinion of someone you know? Maybe you've not had a chance to think about this issue before. Well, today is your chance, is our chance to think about it, to learn about it, and to talk about it. Within this topic, there are many lies that seep into our culture. I'm going to show you a few of them now, which we're going to address on this program.
What do you think dying with dignity means?
Dying with dignity means having control over your own death. You decided how you want to die.
Don't you think the government should be involved in the issue of euthanasia?
How we want to die is a private matter, and the government shouldn't have any business in it.
Why do you think euthanasia is beneficial?
It probably will free up healthcare resources. I mean, we don't have to pay for terminally ill patients or something, like forever.
Who decides when to die?
I may not do it, but I think people have the right to choose when they want to die.
Do you think euthanasia should be regulated?
Euthanasia can be regulated just so that it doesn't become abusive.
What do you think about those who want to take their life because they are in chronic pain?
It's cruel to let someone live in intolerable pain. We don't even do that to dogs.
Assisted suicide is suicide committed with the aid of another person. Physician-assisted suicide is the voluntary termination of one's own life by the administration of a lethal substance, with the direct or indirect assistance of a physician. Physician-assisted suicide involves a doctor knowingly and intentionally providing a person with the knowledge or means or both required to commit suicide, including counseling about lethal dosage of drugs, prescribing such lethal doses, or supplying the drugs. Physician-assisted suicide is often different from euthanasia. In cases of euthanasia, the physician administers the means of death, usually a lethal drug. In physician-assisted suicide, the patient self-administers the means of death. Voluntary euthanasia was legalized in Colombia in 1997, the Netherlands in 2002, Belgium in 2002, Luxembourg in 2008, and Canada in 2016. Assisted suicide, where the patient has to take the final action themselves, is legal in Canada, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and parts of the United States. In the United States, there are assisted dying laws restricted to terminally ill and mentally competent adults in Oregon, Montana, Washington, Vermont, and California. Oregon was the first U.S. state to legalize assisted suicide, which was done through popular vote. The act was a citizens' initiative passed twice by Oregon voters. Oregon has had a physician-assisted suicide law on the books since 1997. Since its enactment, there has been a steady increase in both prescription recipients and the number of deaths. According to data from 2015, as of January 27, 2016, prescriptions have been written for 1,545 people, and 991 patients have died from ingesting the drugs that were legally prescribed to them under the law. According to a 2014 annual report, since 2009, prescriptions have been written for 725 people in Washington state, and there have been 712 reported deaths. Between May 2013 and May 2016, physician reporting firms have been completed for 24 people in Vermont, according to the Department of Health. Legalizing physician-assisted suicide leads to an increase in the total number of people committing suicide. The study, How Does Legalization of Physician-Assisted Suicide Affect Rates of Suicide?, contradicts the notion that legalizing assisted suicide will reduce the total number of suicides by helping people cope with their declining condition. The argument by physician-assisted suicide advocates is that if ill patients have confidence that they will have access to physician-assisted suicide in the future, they will be less likely to commit suicide today or ever. The study, however, shows that suicide increases when physician-assisted suicide is legalized. Controlling for various socioeconomic factors, unobservable state and year effects, and state-specific linear trends, the study found that legalizing PAS, physician-assisted suicide, was associated with a 6.3% increase in total suicides. The researchers commented that the introduction of physician-assisted suicide seemingly induces more self-inflicted deaths than it inhibits. To speak more about assisted suicide and its effects, we have in the studio Christina Paxton, spokesperson for Californians Against Assisted Suicide.
What are your main concerns with assisted suicide, with this question of killing a person who's suffering? Is that not okay?
Our main concern are those most vulnerable in our society. So the elderly who are subject to abuse from a greedy heir or a family member who consistently calls them a burden. We also have concerns about those living with a disability. How will they be treated in a society that basically views their lives as not worth living?
Mm-hmm. You mean that the elderly could be, I guess, pressured into this dying if there was such a right and if this got popular?
Absolutely, and coerced in situations. We don't all live in loving households. We don't all live with people who care for us and put our concerns first. Mm-hmm. And elder abuse has been shown to be on the rise. And we know from states like Oregon, they have the highest incidence of elder suicide in the nation.
Wow. Oregon, just for our viewers, Oregon is where assisted suicide is actually legal in the United States.
That's correct. Oregon and Washington are the two states in the United States where it has been legal the longest, almost a decade now.
Wow. You were saying that the elder abuse has actually increased.
It has. It has. And elder suicide, again, is the highest in Oregon that it is in the nation.
Wow. You also mentioned, as you were speaking there, the disabled. And what's the concern there?
We work with virtually every disability rights organization in the country, and every single one is vehemently opposed to assisted suicide. And that is because their care costs the most. So naturally, when we legalize assisted suicide, they believe they have targets on them, that they are in danger of cutting care, of not getting the care that they need.
Mm-hmm. I guess one of the things that happens in addition when they're doing this assisted suicide, when they're actually killing people with disabilities who are older or whatever, what's happening is society's views towards their own dignity of life also changes.
Absolutely. And again, we see that in places like Oregon where people view the elderly not as to be cared for in the last stages of life, but rather as a burden on society, as leaching out valuable medical resources. And like I said before, with those who are living with a disability, they obviously require the most care for the entire span of their lives. And really, from a cost perspective, they cost the most money and use the most resources. So naturally, they feel like they have a target on them.
Absolutely. I think life, from a Christian perspective, we speak of the sanctity of life, of the holiness of life. God gave us life, and life is not even our own. It's a gift of God, not for us to take away, but His own gift. And I think even from a perspective, a secular perspective, we have that understanding of life being sacred, of life being a gift, of life being the sanctity of life to be protected beyond any other considerations.
Absolutely. And even from a secular perspective, our organization seeks to protect those who are most vulnerable when assisted suicide is legalized, and that includes the elderly and those living with a disability.
This area moves into, I guess, even into childhood, because, we see with the abortion debate, people with disabilities being eliminated first. Down syndrome children, when diagnosed in the womb, are now a 90% likelihood of being killed by abortion before birth. But I understand that in Belgium, for instance, just recently, they've now legalized euthanasia for infants as well, for children.
That is true. And they are a great example of how euthanasia and assisted suicide is just completely uncontrollable, even with so-called safeguards that they build into the law. So the Netherlands legalized assisted suicide roughly 40 years ago. And even back then, they had built in safeguards into their law to protect those most vulnerable, much like the safeguards that we have in our laws in Oregon and Washington. But we see that throughout time, not only has their culture changed and has society changed in views and attitudes toward the most vulnerable people in society, but now you don't even have to have any kind of underlying illness to be euthanized in the Netherlands and in Belgium. And as you just said, they just legalized assisted suicide or euthanasia for children, even though they have no mental capacity to really make that choice.
And again, who is being singled out for death? Those who are disabled, those who, I guess, in the eyes of the new world that doesn't see value in life anymore, says, we put them out of their misery, or probably in reality, put them out of our misery.
Exactly. And again, we have studies that show that the people who are being euthanized in the Netherlands are those who are the most vulnerable. There was a study just done that showed that divorced women are euthanized at a higher rate than anybody else.
Wow.
Yeah.
See, this thing, I think one of the main arguments on the other side is, you can't control it. Euthanasia-assisted suicide, people have the right to suicide. It's been around forever and ever and ever. We have to regulate it and make it safe, put in the safeguards. And I think what we've already heard and seen is that just doesn't work.
No, it doesn't. And we see in places like Oregon and Washington, where, again, it has been legal for about 10 years, abuses occur and safeguards do happen. So we have an example out of Oregon. A woman named Barbara Wagner was diagnosed with cancer. And her doctor, her physician, prescribed the best treatment he knew to cure her cancer and give her the best chance at life. And unfortunately, her health insurance, who was Oregon's state-run health plan, sent her a denial letter for her treatment for her cancer, but wrote on there that her option was assisted suicide. That was something that they would pay for as a health insurance company. So we can see in places where assisted suicide has been legal for quite some time that really control over our medical choices is really taken from us. When assisted suicide is offered, other choices tend to disappear.
Oh, it's a much cheaper solution.
It absolutely is. When you treat a cancer or a sickness or an illness, or with those who are living with a disability, it could cost thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the assisted suicide pills that are prescribed are roughly $100. So in this climate of cost-based insurance, that is definitely the much cheaper solution for an insurance company.
Wow. And if that doesn't speak to the history of some of the dictatorships that we've seen, nothing else would. I think one of the other things that we've heard, or that I've heard anyway, that probably many people haven't heard about, is in the Netherlands, when this has gone on for so long, there is now even a fear of elderly people of going to hospital out of fear of being euthanized. Absolutely, because society has now deemed them a burden. As someone who will siphon off medical care and they're not worthy of that care. The elderly are looked at as a burden. Those living with a disability are looked at as having lives not worth living any longer. Their culture has morphed and changed. Wow. Have you seen any evidence of how to bring back a culture from there, of how to reverse the trend?
I don't know, just people really being educated on what assisted suicide is. I know in Massachusetts, in 2012, we had an assisted suicide bill on the ballot. That was 2012. And early polls showed that almost 70% of voters in Oregon supported assisted suicide until word got out as to what assisted suicide really was. And in a very short period of time, the polls swung dramatically and question 2 was defeated.
Oh, wow. So what are some of the messages that you used, that you told people? What did you tell them? What is assisted suicide?
Definitely what we wanted to get across and what we want people to understand is that this kind of legislation is completely uncontrollable, and that people that we as a society should be protecting and caring for and offering services to so they can live out meaningful lives, those most vulnerable are the most impacted by such legislation. Again, Barbara Wagner, who was unable to have her cancer treatment paid for by her insurance. Those choices are taken away from all of us. Those living with a disability live in abject fear of such legislation because, again, they cost the most to care for. But really, a compassionate society needs to care for those people and needs to offer them the services in order to live out these meaningful lives, not offer them suicide.
One of the priest friends of mine that I know, he talks about how there is suffering in our world, and suffering is for us a call to reach out to the suffering person and to help that suffering person. And the thing not to do is it's not a call to kill the suffering person.
Absolutely. And again, a just society doesn't take away all options for the person who really needs care and then offer suicide as some kind of compassionate choice.
I guess one of the other big arguments that people use is with the whole idea of pain. Pain is tough. Pain is excruciating. Cancer patients experience excruciating pain. People in chronic illnesses, it's forever. How do you answer them with regard to, hey, I mean, we put the dog down when he's in pain. You don't have as much compassion even for your friend or whatever. You're saying you can't have compassion on your friend, you can't end his pain.
I think that is one of the biggest myths that we really try and shed light on. There have been such great advancements in palliative care, even over the last decade. It is completely unnecessary for anyone to be in pain. Again, we have made huge strides, and within our organization, we have many palliative care specialists who can very easily speak to this issue. There is no reason for someone to be in pain. And even those pushing assisted suicide, Compassion and Choices, which used to be the Hemlock Society, for example, their director in New York freely admitted this is not about pain. Even proponents of assisted suicide know that this isn't an issue of pain because that is something we can control. Doctors have been polled and say that they can control virtually all patient's pain in any case, which is amazing. We live in an amazing time. So the issue of pain is not really an issue. And it really, once we take the pain away, that really negates any need for any kind of assisted suicide legislation.
Well, I guess it might, though, come back in terms of, hey, it's cheaper to treat with assisted suicide than maybe the pain medication.
Absolutely. And again, that is one of the reasons why virtually every disability rights organization is so vehemently opposed to assisted suicide, not only in the United States, but all over the world. Opening up access to hospice cares for those who are elderly and in their last stages of life, and to give them the dignity that they deserve, all thoughts of assisted suicide dissipate. We can remove that from the equation, making assisted suicide legalization completely unnecessary.
Did you like the program you just watched? Help Shalom World bring more programs like this to a global audience. Your support helps us share the peace of Christ with the world. Visit shalomworld.org/donate.
The people who are being euthanized are the most vulnerable. A compassionate society needs to care for those people, not offer them suicide.
The medical profession, I think, is profoundly affected as well. I mean, their whole purpose is life and the making better of life, the preservation of life, to save lives. Yet, with the advent of assisted suicide, it turns it completely on its head, and they're the bringers of death.
Absolutely. And, again, we have in our organization many, many doctors, but virtually every state's American Medical Association is opposed to assisted suicide. So in every state, there are active chapters of the AMA who push and make sure people understand this is not something we want as physicians. Because again, in Oregon and Washington, not only is that choice taken away from patients who want to go through with their chemotherapy or want the medication to go on living meaningful lives, but Barbara Wagner's doctor, he wanted that medication for her. That is what he suggested for her as well. So it takes control not only away from the patients, but it takes control away from the doctors as well.
Right. There are sometimes very difficult cases where people are going to be in hospital for a very long time. They're going to be maybe, totally paralyzed for a long time. And people would ask, well, what kind of quality of life can they have? They can move their lips and that's it. Are you talking even no suicide for those guys and what do you answer?
Absolutely. And again, our coalition of disability rights activists have worked very hard to communicate to people that even though they have a loss of some of those abilities, that they still lead amazing, meaningful lives. So that is, again, they don't want to project that image of you're useless, you're worthless, your life is not worth living, because in their view, their lives are great. They go on to live amazing, meaningful lives.
Murder is never justified. That's why language is so important. If people can change language to make society believe you're not killing a person, but rather taking away their suffering, then it's much more palatable. So language has to be changed so society's conscience is okay with doing this. First, it was called mercy killing or euthanasia in ancient times. Then physician-assisted suicide was the term most used, and legislation passed in many states using that term. Today, the favored term is death with dignity, although no one has yet been able to tell me what's dignified about a doctor killing his or her patient, or about a loved one trying to kill a suffering relative. We have very good pain relief techniques these days, and intractable pain is not a reason to kill someone. There's morphine, there's other medications, and the Catholic Church teaches that it's fine to use these other medications because your intent is not to kill the person, but to alleviate the pain. And intent is all important in these situations. When the intent is to eliminate suffering by eliminating the person, that's when we have a problem.
I think, in older cultures, there were more used to the idea that the elderly were there to pass on the wisdom of the fathers or wisdom of the previous generations. And I think with the advent of this utilitarian concept of usefulness and the openness to killing off the older or the disabled, a lot of that is being lost along the way. A lot of the respect for the elderly, a lot of the looking to them, for example, for the passing on of the traditions is getting lost.
Absolutely. And again, that is one of our focuses, to just protect those who are elderly and protect them from the abuse that occurs when assisted suicide is legalized. Because again, we see it in places like Oregon and Washington, where elder suicide is the highest in the nation. We see it in places like in the Netherlands, where they are constantly being barraged by a message from society that says, you are a burden. Your life is no longer valuable. Just end it. That's not the culture we want to have here. And that is one of the goals of Californians Against Assisted Suicide. We want to make sure that those people, those who are elderly, are free from abuse and coercion.
Seems like then the sort of so-called right to die sort of turns into a duty to die.
Absolutely. Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah. It is a very concerning thing. You already hear with even some of my own relatives, when they get older, the talk already, even though assisted suicide isn't quite legal in Canada, we were very close with Quebec just now, but there's already talk of, I don't want to be a burden, I am ready to go whenever. Just that concept has already moved its way into people's minds. And it's a very scary thing.
It's frightening, and I'm sure it is. I can imagine it would be frightening for those who are elderly. And again, we need to look out for those people and care for them and offer them the services they need at the end of their life, which is why we fight for access to great palliative care, which is why we make sure everybody understands their options when it comes to hospice. Those are things that we can do as a society to make sure those who are elderly are protected.
Explain that. What is palliative care? What is hospice care?
Palliative care has to do with taking away pain at the end of life or when you're suffering from an illness. And again, we can take the pain away. Pain isn't really an issue. We can remove that from the equation, making assisted suicide legalization completely unnecessary, and opening up access to hospice cares for those who are elderly and in their last stages of life is a great way for them to be comfortable in those last stages.
The American College of Physicians, American Society of Internal Medicine does not support the legalization of physician-assisted suicide. The routine practice of physician-assisted suicide raises serious ethical and other concerns. Legalization would undermine the patient-physician relationship and the trust necessary to sustain it, alter the medical profession's role in society, and endanger the value our society places on life, especially on the lives of disabled, incompetent, and vulnerable individuals. The ACP-ASIM remains thoroughly committed to improving care for patients at the end of life. The arguments in favor of legalizing physician-assisted suicide are weighty, and compelling individual cases of suffering are distressing. However, after carefully considering all the arguments, the ACP-ASIM opposed to the legalization of physician-assisted suicide even in limited circumstances. The American College of Physicians American Society of Internal Medicine, in their position paper, stated that one can raise serious questions about whether or not medicine should arrogate to itself the task of relieving all human suffering. Our culture's goal of eliminating death is a false goal. By acknowledging that the elimination of all human suffering is also a false goal that, if pursued, will ultimately lead to bad medical care. Good medicine demands compassion for the dying, but compassion needs reason too. Physicians are called to use their skills to eliminate or alleviate the medical conditions that cause suffering at the end of life. This includes the palliation of both somatic symptoms such as pain and nausea, and psychological conditions such as depression and anxiety. But the feeling of helplessness shared by both patient and physician when the patient continues to suffer despite the power of contemporary medical palliative technology is not sufficient to justify assistance with suicide. To be compassionate means to suffer with another person. The physician who remains with the dying patient but has not participated in assisted suicide on the patient's request has not acted without compassion, nor has she or he abandoned the patient. When patients continue to suffer from physical symptoms or psychiatric syndromes, despite the best efforts of palliation, physicians should vigorously pursue the alleviation of these symptoms, even at the risk of unintentionally hastening death. But when the patient's suffering is interpersonal, existential, or spiritual, the task of the physician are to remain present, to suffer with the patient in compassion, and to enlist the support of clergy, social workers, family, and friends in healing the aspects of suffering that are beyond the legitimate scope of medical care. With the legalization of physician-assisted suicide, it increased the number of suicides and it endangers the weak and marginalized, corrupts the practice of medicine, compromises the culture, particularly the family, and betrays human dignity and equality before the law.
Well, in pretty recent history, a beautiful example of being a willingness to allow old age and disability to have their effect and yet go forward. And that was in Pope John Paul II. If you remember, he was Pope for a very, very long time. He was there as a fairly young man as Pope when he was still skiing. But the world went with him and watched him as he got older, as his abilities left him, as he was, even in the last years of his life, hunched over and having to try and still offer Mass with, one hand in the air. And we were very used to, at the end of his life, seeing his sort of crumpled body, as it were. His spirit was very much alive. Mm-hmm. He was joyful still, but in that body which wasn't quite there anymore, but he stuck it out. He stuck it out so beautifully that he still was the Pope of the Catholic Church, and here his body was failing him. But he held on in a beauty. He held on, I think, to give such a beautiful example of the endurance of, yes, there is suffering that comes with that, and look at the disability, but there's a beauty in that life. And I remember as he lay dying, there was massive crowds that came. And here was this old man. Here was this man for whom life was completely spent, who for the last number of years has been going around almost unable to walk, and yet the Pope of the Catholic Church, and now is lying in this hospital bed dying. And what is happening outside his window are hundreds of thousands of people there to honor him, to honor his life, and knowing that he didn't give up. He didn't ask for assisted suicide. He embraced life for as long as God gave him that life. He allowed himself to live it out, even with some suffering. And it was a beautiful example. It was, I think, inspiring to millions.
And that is a great example of how it can be different for different elderly people, and why we seek to protect those who may not have so many adoring people supporting you and loving you and really lifting you up with their thoughts. There are many elderly people who don't have loving families like that, who don't have people to care for them, and who aren't going to protect them in the last stages of life, whether it be a greedy heir or just a selfish person who doesn't want to care for that elderly person and sees them as a burden. So again, we want to make sure as a society that we protect those people, that we give them the services necessary to complete their lives, to live out their lives, and that we open up those services and give them access to palliative care and hospice care.
Absolutely. And I think within those services, there's a call, I think, for all Christians to reach out to those folks, because especially if they're in situations where family doesn't care about them or doesn't want to care about them, or maybe just even isn't there, there is an opportunity, a massive opportunity for Christians to reach out in palliative care homes or in hospitals where people are in chronic care, to be with them, to minister to them. And I think there's some really great opportunities for us as Christians, as people who care.
We have some phenomenal members of our coalition who are palliative care specialists and workers and hospice workers who do just that. Just amazing people who care for those in their last stages of life, to make them comfortable and to let them fulfill their lives in a dignified way.
And I bet you a lot of those folks, when they're talking to people who are in their last stages or in chronic care, I bet you they've got some amazing insights, some amazing stories as well that they have received. They don't only give, they also receive.
They really do. In fact, I was listening to one of the palliative care specialists who had been doing her job for 33 years. And she talked about the fear that elderly people come into hospice with and the fear that they have that they will be in pain. And she says, once they get here and we are able to minimize their pain, to make them comfortable, and to give them the dignity that they deserve, all thoughts of assisted suicide dissipate. So it's up to us to just make sure that people understand that those options exist.
Absolutely. Christina, I want to thank you very much for coming to us and helping shed light on those very common misconceptions, helping us to come to a fuller understanding of the truth.
Thank you so much for having me.
Excellent. If somebody wants more information from you, wants to look you up, where can they do that?
They can go to noassistedsuicideca.org. They can also visit us on Facebook and Twitter.
Excellent. Excellent. There is also another organization which Californians Against Assisted Suicide is affiliated with called the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. They're an international coalition, and you can access them online at epcc.ca. Once again, my friends, we have been given a wealth of information that brings to us, that tells us the truth that comes from God and is taught by His church. Have your opinions shifted during the course of our discussion? Do you feel more ready now to defend the faith? It's my hope that you are and do, and that you will do so with truth in love. Remember that we are told in the scriptures that our bodies are not ours. They are the temple of the Holy Spirit, and he who destroys the temple will be destroyed himself. We are also told in the same place that God will never give us more than we can bear. And with that in mind, and until next time, let's go forward and see in the suffering not a person whose life needs to be ended, but a call for us to be there for them, to be with them, as Christ was to the poor. God bless you.